So we're gonna load the slides for our third and final speaker for today, and it's Dr. Erin Evans, who is a faculty member in the Department of Sociology at San Diego Mesa College in California, and she's joining us from California today. And she is also the chair of the Animals and Society section within the American Sociological Association. Her most recent work speaks to a vast academic and activist audience who is concerned with, she is concerned with illuminating the precise interconnections with and between economic globalization, climate change, social movements, and animal rights. Her talk today, Care Movements at the Nexus of Structural Violence, will undoubtedly advance these interconnections and topics. So without wasting more time, let's get to Dr. Evans.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction, and I also really appreciate the presentations that I've seen. Christian at the last presentation mentioned something about there being an app for every problem, and then somebody asked about an app for environmental justice, and I loved the response about using it for tracking different outcomes or different environmental problems that you see out and about. And I think that's a great idea, because one thing that's really hard is finding data on some of these industries that violate regulations, and it's very hard to keep track of them. So anyway, I really appreciate being here, and I really appreciate the presentations. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. Let me just fix this so it is, there we go. All right. So yeah, thank you again. And the title of this project, and I'm going to be super open and say that I'm going to present on a few different projects at once right now. But the title of this one, Care Movements at the Nexus of Structural Violence. And I'll spend some time defining terms. I'll define some concepts, what I mean by care movements, what is structural violence. Then I'll talk about how animal advocacy and animal care and environmentalism, especially some of the things that have been talked about over the last 3 days, how these can be conceptualized as parts of care movements. And I'll talk about how care movements are kind of unintended coalitions that are responding to common forms of structural violence. And I should say one thing I notice with the presentation so far is that the students and scholars, there is this expression of care for what and whom is being studied, right? Especially, I'm thinking of Javier and how they were describing the birds and describing what they were seeing, and how there was so much care put into those descriptions and put into speaking of their migration patterns and such. And I think this speaks to how I'm conceptualizing care and how scholars have conceptualized care. So I'll start with defining care work, what I mean by care work. Care work is something that's been studied by scholars for a very long time. Scholars like Arlie Hochschild, Mignon Duffy, look at care work as a section of the sector of the labor market that provides a service, but it is a service that is absolutely necessary for the basic functioning of society. So we can think of care work as socialization processes, teaching children. You can think of it as nursing, healing, childcare, elderly care. These are all forms of labor that are, again, necessary for the basic functionings of society. And yet scholars have found that this form of labor is systematically devalued. Not only that, but this labor sector has been traditionally done by women. It's a gendered profession that's changing over time with some of these professions that are becoming higher paid, like nursing in California, but predominantly care work is a form of labor that has been systematically devalued and has not been given the kinds of support and accolades that it should be given how necessary it is. So when we think of care work and care movements at the center of structural violence, I'm taking the term structural violence primarily from Paul Farmer, who is a public health scholar who looks at public health outcomes and how global economic policies have influenced health of people in the global South. So he describes structural violence as being social arrangements that put specific groups in harm's way. He's not the first one to use the term. The term goes back to Johann Galtung. Hopefully I'm pronouncing the name properly. But the way that I'm using it is drawn from Paul Farmer's work and looking specifically at how social arrangements, specifically economic policy, the political arrangements, are set up in some ways to put groups in harm's way. So like when we think of violence, we oftentimes think of something immediate, right? Where something is hit, something is hurt, something is destroyed. But in this way, violence is conceptualized to acknowledge that there are forms of harm that come from the context and come from our conditions over which we don't have as much control, but that exert forms of harm on groups. So again, he focuses on global and domestic social policy and economic policy that are business friendly and cause harm to public health. I'm saying business friendly as a really simplistic way of conceptualizing neoliberalism. I'm going to not spend as much time defining neoliberalism, given the amount of time we have. But neoliberalism we can think of as a set of policy approach that was instituted, like late 70s, early 80s, that seeks to open up markets, seeks to open up trade, seeks to privatize institutions that were previously public, things like this. So he looks at these kinds of policies, these kinds of structures as impacting groups who are in disadvantaged positions in disproportionate ways as other groups. So when we think of structural violence and care workers are at the front lines of structural violence. So when we think of, especially nurses, I'll use nurses as an example. When I started using the term structural violence and when I started becoming more aware of the connections between animal advocacy and healthcare in the US, it was through this term, and it was because of working in this nurses union. I was working with nurses from across the country who were at the bedside and who were they're experiencing the ways that people are put in harm's way. And so my role in the union as an educator was to take their experiences at the bedside and to couch it in the broader social structures and social forces that are causing these things that they're seeing at the bedside. So like in emergency rooms, they have a term for people who go in and out of the emergency room consistently, frequent flyers. These are folks who might overdose repeatedly, alcoholics, people experiencing houselessness, and the reaction when you know, for the nurses is of course compassion and care, but also it's like you're interacting with this individual person, and oftentimes they would lose track of there being broader conditions that were influential to what they were seeing. So care workers see this, right? They see evidence of structural violence in front of them. And they also experience it in terms of performing a form of labor that is systematically devalued. And so care workers over time have been forming, have formed movements, these care movements. And if you look in the scholarship, scholars typically describe healthcare movements or care movements as specifically attached to healthcare. But we have care movements like domestic workers who mobilize on behalf of immigrant rights issues, workers' rights issues, like this group, Domestic Workers United, which is an alt union group that fights for their for adequate wages, for adequate legal protection. Movements of teachers, teachers unions fighting for smaller class sizes, fighting for adequate pay. Nurses involved in movements. These movements are care workers who are not only fighting on behalf of themselves, but also are fighting on behalf of individuals who do not have adequate access to care. And that's the important part that draws me to environmentalism and care work, environmentalism and animal advocacy, I should say. So again, there's a couple points that I have to kind of gloss over a bit, but one of them is the topic of the transnational care economy, or the ways that care workers, there are transnational migration patterns of care workers that serve to really sustain multiple countries in terms of having care work available for people there. So that is a part of this story, and I will kind of, for the sake of time, put that aside and go into the connection with animal advocacy. So again, care workers have traditionally been looked at as nurses, teachers, domestic workers. I broaden the scope and include environmentalists, environmental work, as well as animal advocates into the concept of care work. And I do so because it fits the definition of care work. One component of care work that's used in the literature is the expense of emotional labor. There being an increased amount of emotional labor that's put into care work. And we see this with forms of animal care and animal advocacy, where, for instance, the student Stephanie Belland, who did a presentation for the International Vegan Sociology Association over the summer, discussed how animal advocates who perform open rescues, where they rescue animals from factory farms that are in violation of regulations that are supposed to be upheld, how they go into these spaces and rescue animals. And this is a tremendous amount of emotional labor that's put into this. Companion animal work, working in animal shelters. This again is a huge amount of emotional labor and a form of care that's necessary to the functioning of society, especially when looking at historically some of the problems that have occurred because of companion animal abuse. And then on this other side, I'm looking at food animals. And this is another intersection of animals and care workers, where I take farm workers and also put them in into the realm of care workers. And we don't usually think of it that way. So the picture below of a person working in a factory farm, right? We don't typically see people working in factory farms as being care workers. In fact, these workers are typically demonized by animal rights movements. And this is becoming increasingly criticized because these workers are just as much exploited by large corporations as animals are. And what I contend is that what we've seen historically, where when people were working with the animals, at least before the animals were killed, there was a type of care that was put into those animals that we do not see in factory farms now. And that's evidence of the ways that corporations pro-business policies that reward growth and profit building at the expense of anything ends up subverting an institution that involved animal care before into a place where not only the animals, not only the non-human animals, but the human animals are also treated like machines and treated as are abused inside these workplaces. And it's kind of where we see this entanglement, an entanglement of movements representing these individuals in these different institutions that are seemingly different, but are all mobilizing around the same economic and political structures that cause these problems that we see. So I usually don't put a ton of words on a slide, but for this one, care movements through this lens exposes the shared political and economic structures that are targeted by social movements with seemingly different grievances. So that includes animal abuse, environmental destruction, and exploitation of a global working class. So I described before the kind of evolution of food production, animal food production, where before there was a certain amount of care during the agrarian era before industrialization, and in some small farm situations now, that there are forms of care that are put into animals before they're killed that we don't see anymore in larger factory farm situations, where the animals and the people are both treated as instruments to build profit, and that's also at the expense of the environment. This project came out of a chapter that I wrote that was on climate change and multi-species refugees. So when we think of climate change and think of weather-induced or climate change-induced weather events like flooding, the fires that we saw in the Amazon, these weather events cause massive migration of people fleeing areas. The countries of the global South typically experience the effects of climate change more so than people in the global North, both because they don't have access to resources and because of problems in infrastructure. And these weather events cause patterns of migration with refugees, right? And that's not just human, but there's also animal refugees as well, right? When you have the for instance, this picture with the koala during the fires that were in Australia as well. During these fires, animals are also fleeing, and so we see how the effects of climate change come down in this intersecting way on people and animals, both suffering the effects of of climate change in their environment. In terms of factory farming, going back, factory farming is one of the largest contributors to carbon emissions, and it speaks to how farming and animal care has become subverted into this mass industry that's contributing to a global crisis. So another place this came from, Rising Tide is an organization that is one of these organizations that's working at at the intersection. There aren't that many, it's kind of hard to do, right? For social movement organizations to address multiple issues at once is a difficult thing. A lot of that has to do with how they maintain membership, you know, the types of like organizational identities that they have to, that they establish. But there are organizations who are working across these forms of violence, and Rising Tide is one of them. This quote from them was during the Amazon fires. The wrong Amazon is burning, the wrong ice is melting. So they're connecting Amazon as a corporation to climate change, and looking as well at immigration and how immigration policies always mirror market demands for immigrants in the US, right? So we see this, again, intersection of movements who are I see it as like a constellation of movements who are not coordinating with each other deliberately, but they're all hovering around this central structure, which are economic policies that serve to deprive care. You know, political and economic structures like dismantling, you know, and not providing commodified healthcare, things like this are political or like social arrangements that serve to take care away from people. And so we see mobilizations of care workers and care movements in response to that. Care workers over time in all major social movements, like the civil rights movement, where women preparing food for people engaging in civil disobedience were very central to keeping the movement going. We had this with union uprisings. Care workers are central to social movements, and they are central in terms of being their own movements as well. And so I'm going to go on to talking about some of the ways that we see intersectionality being addressed by animal advocacy. With animal advocacy, the traditional frame has been animal cruelty, right? The grievance of animal advocates has been animal cruelty first and foremost. But then we see arguments for health in terms of meat and dairy and the health effects of meat and dairy, the effects of factory farming on the environment, and how those environmental effects that environmental destruction also affects the health of people. Paying attention to the hyper-exploitation of migrant labor, gender issues, and just recently now there being more of a focus on race as well. So like with the Animals and Society section, we recently published an essay dialogue looking at decentering whiteness in animal advocacy and the study of animal advocacy. Moses Scenerine, in one of his essays here, wrote actions of solidarity are occurring. And this intersection of race, workers and meat plants, and the pandemic is an important one for scholars to explore. So that is it. Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate being given this space to talk about my work. Thank you.
Sure. And you can go ahead and stop sharing. We do have a couple of questions. I guess I'll start with my question because I think it's a bit introductory. One of the rationales that I teach my students about why we do environmental studies is so that we can avoid compartmentalizing those issues and sort of cordoning those things off from all of the other sort of structural problems that we have in our society and global crises that are in sort of other areas. At the same time, you mentioned the difficulty of organizations that are taking on multiple issues or trying to be I guess, intersectional in a more fundamental way than just acknowledging that there's other problems. Um, so I guess my question is, where do you see the power in really studying those intersections, and what are the challenges of them? So that's like a huge question. You can take it.
Yeah. but I love that thank you for that you articulated that question, that very complicated question so clearly. And I think I'm going to start with the problem of being an organization that needs to mobilize people in a cohesive way, and keep those people and having to seemingly compete with other organizations while keeping people. And I think what I'm finding is that I'm not sure if there is even a necessity to think about it that, whatchamacallit, how should I say this? I think what I'm proposing is more so to explain the patterns that I'm already seeing in movements that are happening, where care movements and movements that are seeking to provide the kind of care that liberates as opposed to the kind of care that is charity. Those movements that are seeking to provide that kind of care, again, are gravitating towards the same structural problems that are common to animal advocates, that are common to foster care, that I'm finding that are common to climate change. And so I'm not sure if whatchamacallit, I'm not sure if I would say that there needs to be a solution to it, but rather maybe it's a way for us to think about what organizations we want to support and how do we want to behave as advocates ourselves in terms of how we participate. And yeah, I'm not happy with that answer I just gave. Yeah, complicated one.
Yes, to me, it sounds like what's important is to kind of learn from each other, learn sort of across those intersections so that we can more, I guess, more precisely represent the problems that we're encountering, and the overall structure that's creating those inequalities.
Yeah, maybe it's maybe where this is coming into play is in the agenda setting process, right? That early part of a social movement where they are identifying the problem. Like maybe that's where what we're talking about is the most relevant. When you're identifying the problem, here's where the problem is. I feel like also where it might be relevant on a more practical level is in terms of infighting, the unfortunate ways that movements pick fights with each other. I think part of it is because they're trying to attract more members. I think part of it might be just lovely human ego, but maybe the ways that movements fight with each other, especially animal rights and environmentalism. This is a problem where these are two movements that are the same. It's the same movement, like environmental protection, animal protection, and human protection. That is like, I mean, it's the same. And the fact that there is any kind of like, why are you protecting the environment when this thing is happening over here? And why are you caring about animals when this thing is happening over there? It's like, let's get rid of the infighting and just recognize that the problems that we're addressing are common to all of us.
That's really great. I think that is the good sort of practical outcome. And I was going to talk about that competition that you're pointing to, and that sort of need to value certain causes over others. That seems to be, as you said, kind of part of human nature. When people are passionate about something, they want to articulate that as being the most important thing, whereas someone else obviously has a different understanding. So that's cool. I think that is really useful. And I love what you said about the animal rights movement and the environmental movement being sort of the same movement. Another question is, can you give specifics on and I think this is more about animal rights activists oriented question. Can you give specifics on how to stop or change gag rules used to criminalize animal rights activists beyond voting? And two, how do we persuade people? Well, these are really two separate questions. So why don't I let you take that one first?
The question on the gag laws, that is such an important thing happening right now that speaks to transparency. I think one thing that has, see, I get excited and like even responding to that. So one thing that I found in like past research is that the laws that have a lot of effect, that give activists a way to act as like a springboard for more change, are laws that afford activists a way to get inside of the institution to participate in decision making. This taps into gag laws because it speaks to transparency. One of the reasons why that is so powerful is because a lot of practices that are not good are a lot of them are already supposed to be illegal or against policy, but policies are hard to enforce, and a lot of it, and a lot of it is it's behind closed doors. So I think I feel like what I encourage my students to do oftentimes, especially students of mine who are going into environmentalism or going into social work or going into nonprofit work, is find a way to get inside of the institution that you're trying to affect. The negative side to that is the potential for being kind of co-opted yourself. You take on the role of this institution. You start, acting in ways out of like survival of that institution instead of trying to change it from inside. That is a danger that definitely exists. But I encourage my students to keep that in mind. And if there's something you want to change, try to get inside of it and change it from inside. Which is such a simplistic kind of an answer, but I feel like there's something to it if enough people act that way.
For sure. And then the second question was, how do we persuade people that not all jobs should follow the typical business model, that caregiving labor is premised on other kinds of human relationships beyond supplier and supply and demand, and I think like client caregiving.
So it's like the ways that care is commodified. Like how do we revalue care work while not treating it as this commodifiable thing that we don't want to participate in. I think the way to do it is by providing certain things publicly. I think if things like healthcare were treated like a human right, if access to food, access to shelter were treated like human rights, I think care work would become something that were, as opposed to being open to only people who can afford it, that would serve to make it a public good. I think making something a public good is the opposite of no, not the opposite, challenges the notion of commodifying it. That's probably too soon. And if you all have, I'd love to hear like you have like your insight as well. You know what I mean?
There's some back and forth happening on Facebook, but I think that Dr. Jorgensen has a question.
Well, it might help articulate maybe additional answers, but I think you bring up something quite interesting and actually quite concrete. So there's been a lot of ink spilled for a long time about the role of labor unions in the environmental movement, and then that conflict that you've been speaking to. So I guess my question's about what you're observing, but also maybe a potential there as well, even if you're not observing this. When you look at the farm factory workers and the treatment of animals and the treatment of the workers themselves, do you think that labor union demands are changing or need to change in those locations? First, you need to unionize to begin with, but are union demands catching up to the type of movements that you're viewing? Because it seems to me is that the treatment of animals would coincide with lessening and reforming that exploitation rate of the workers.
Totally. Yeah. No, I see. Yeah, I see what you mean. In terms of, I know that within unions, there is talk about there needing to be unions representing broad labor sectors as opposed to representing individual organizations. I know that is something that is discussed as needing to be on the radar. It's just so hard in this context. It is so hostile to unions right now that it's like, even for them to maintain the right to collectively bargain has been hard. But maybe when that changes and unions build, that might be a way to address that, right? Like by looking at broad labor sectors instead of individual. And I'm trying to remember the terms that are used in the labor studies. It's been a while, to be honest. But yeah, as opposed to representing, that's what it is, as opposed to representing a profession, representing the entire labor sector that profession is involved in. I mean, that would be, that would be one way, but the context towards unions would have to change, I think.
Okay, thank you so much. We really appreciate this talk and appreciate you coming all the way coming all the way here from the Pacific time zone, right? and really do appreciate having you and hearing about some of these intersectional things, because I think these issues are things that we're all kind of working with in our environmental studies program, and the challenges that you spoke of, where we're trying to, we have this goal of getting people all on the same page, I think is something that we're trying to further all the time. So really appreciate these kinds of insights. And especially during this time when care workers are really like beyond essential workers during the pandemic, I think this has been a really timely discussion. So thanks so much, Dr. Evans.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the space, and I appreciate your program. Just the existence of it is great.
Okay, thank you so much. And that's actually our final speaker for the 2020 symposium. So we hit a high note here at the end. And if you missed anything in the past 3 days, the video is going to be up on the Environmental Studies Facebook page. And please reach out to Stephanie or myself if you have any questions about the program, and we can guide you to answers. So thank you again. Thank you, Stephanie, for all her hard work. And we will see you soon.